This is the Samsung Galaxy S3. Released in 2012, it would quickly become one of the best-selling Android smartphones of all time, thrusting Samsung into a completely new era of success and dominance. The S3 would massively impact the future of the smartphone industry, featuring a big, bold AMOLED screen, streamlined design, and enough packed-in features to make your head spin. This phone deserves so much credit as to why Samsung remains an absolute behemoth today, and while it's already about 13 years old, it may in fact hold up far better than you would expect. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and today we're taking a look at one of the most iconic Android smartphones ever made. How does the Samsung Galaxy S3 hold up all these years later?
Hey, they're saying that this phone's gonna be like a precious jewel.
Ooh, I love that.
The headphone jack is going to be on the bottom.
I heard the connector is all digital.
What?
What does that even mean?
Who knows? I'm psyched.
All I'm saying is that they should have a priority line for people who've waited 5 times.
I heard you have to have an adapter to use the dock on the new one.
Yeah, but they make the coolest adapters.
Welcome back.
Guess that Galaxy S3 didn't work out.
No, I love the GS3. It's extremely awesome. I'm just saving a spot in line for someone.
That's not cool.
Yeah, man.
This year, we're finally getting everything that we didn't get last year.
Yeah.
The big screen.
True 4G.
Yep. What is that?
Hey, what'd you just do?
Oh, I just sent him a playlist.
By touching phones?
Yep. Simple as that.
It's the Galaxy S3.
Hey!
Hey, Mom, Dad.
Oh, thanks for holding our spot.
Hey, man.
Oh, hey.
How's it going?
Saved you a spot.
I moved on.
But you're not gonna miss all this?
I got the Samsung GS3 now. Is that a Samsung?
That's a new Samsung.
It is. It's pretty cool.
But I kind of like it.
This one's 4G.
Yeah, we've had that for a while.
This one's got a big screen.
This one has a bigger one. And we can share videos instantly. You can watch a video while you're sending an email.
Well, we're gonna get that, for sure. Maybe not this time, but the next time, right?
The next big thing is already here, the Samsung Galaxy S3.
The smartphone market was sitting at a pivotal juncture when the Galaxy S3 released the May of 2012, and this would be a phone perfectly set up to become a huge hit and wild commercial success, driving Samsung to the forefront of the Android manufacturer race. The phone was bigger, bolder, and more jam-packed with enticing features than anything else on the market right when more and more people were buying smartphones for often the first time. You've gotta love the attitude of Samsung to play commercials like that. They weren't bothering to compete with LG or HTC, they were going straight for the big guy in Apple, because they knew full well that that was where the customers were. And at a time where Apple's iPhone progress for some people was starting to feel a bit stale from the iPhone 4, 4S, and 5, it all made for the perfect opportunity for Samsung to encourage customers to try something actually different, something that felt fresh and new. And we really can't understate just how successful this phone was. It sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 million units, approximately the same number as the 2013 Galaxy S4, making these two devices the best-selling Android smartphones ever made to date. This was up from 40 million S2 units sold. Unprecedented numbers for a touchscreen smartphone made by any company not named Apple. Even today, as far as I can tell, Samsung hasn't been able to come anywhere close to matching these unit sales, with the closest being the Galaxy S7 and S7 Edge coming in at 55 million units. Again, the reasoning for this success was clear. Smartphones were due for a dramatic shakeup, and Samsung was providing just that, unafraid to experiment and really push the technology forward in a way that Apple wasn't yet willing to try. Samsung in these days never hesitated to give their users choice. In fact, they often threw far too many features and options at them, which could be both good and bad. But the S3, being one of the earlier Galaxies, struck a really solid balance, offering accessibility and versatility that you just couldn't get from an iPhone, like expandable memory and a swappable battery. You also had some important features like 4G LTE and, really interestingly, NFC, this being one of the earliest smartphones to incorporate it. It would take 2.5 years before Apple would add NFC to the iPhone 6 and implement Apple Pay, just for some perspective, but all the way back on the S3 you had S-Beam for simple data sharing. But what really made this phone stand out from the crowd was the early phablet form factor. We're looking at an eye-popping 720p 4.8-inch Super AMOLED display that was unlike anything else, and particularly really stood out compared to iPhone. While the iPhone 4S's quite small 3.5-inch screen was technically slightly sharper, the additional size and far more vibrant colors of the S3 made it feel like it was in a different league for the users this form factor appealed to. By embracing the large size, Samsung had carved out a whole new niche within the smartphone market, one completely untapped by Apple and many other competitors to this point. Don't forget, this was 2012, a time where smartphones were still relatively new, but were more and more fast becoming media consumption devices, something you use to watch YouTube videos or scroll through social media. iPhones were still small, even with the 4-inch iPhone 5 in late 2012, because cell phones had been small for a long time. It's just how they were. But Samsung had the foresight and boldness to push the boundaries of what could be fit into your pocket, and they would be immediately reaping the benefits of it. The S2 was important, but I would argue the S3 right here is the smartphone that really made Samsung into the company it is today and allowed them to become this behemoth they grew into. And hey, if you wanted something even bigger, you could always go with the 5.5-inch Note 2 when that would launch only a few months later. Samsung excelled at giving their users choice, and while that wouldn't always be their main selling point with eventual devices like the Galaxy S6, which removed a lot of versatility, this phone here is exactly what the smartphone market demanded in 2012. Of course, this phone does feel a bit small compared to devices of today, but far more modern than you would expect for a 13-year-old phone. The build here is a sleek, glossy polycarbonate plastic. There's no texture or anything fancy on my white model, it's just a plain and simple plastic shell, and I kind of respect how straightforward it is. It's nothing like the ultra-premium feeling glass and stainless steel of the iPhone 4S or the aluminum of the iPhone 5, but it is light, functional, and durable. Plus, you can easily pull off that back, giving us access to the micro SD card slot and removable battery. There are more color options, and some have a brushed metal look if you find that appealing. I've never been a fan of that because, I mean, it is plastic, so why not own it? And actually, to be honest, it's kind of confusing just how many colors of this phone exist. Like, apparently there's a brown Galaxy S3. I've never seen one of those in person before. I kind of wonder who would buy it. Like, brown plastic, it's like, if it was leather, that's one, you know what, it's fine, just move on. The design in general here is just really nice. It's different, and it's not the most premium, but it feels good in the hand with this curvature, this almost like teardrop sort of design. You've got the power button on the side of the phone, a headphone jack at the top, and micro USB on the bottom. I could live without this sort of fake metal looking frame since it is plastic, but it's colored like it could be metal. But that was just sort of a typical Samsung thing from around this time, and at least it looks nice. The home button's kind of weirdly small. They were definitely still finding their footing for how they would design that, but I appreciate how the navigation buttons can disappear and light up as you need to use them. It makes the front of the phone look significantly cleaner. Overall, just the design of this phone in general is really clean, and I quite like it. It's different from iPhone, and that's okay. I'd say it's a good thing. It makes the phone feel even more fresh than it already felt back in 2012. But that display, really, that was the big thing here. That's what made this phone feel so unique. My S3 here I actually bought brand new a few years back off eBay, and I did do a retro unboxing video that I'll link in the description if you're curious as to what these phones came with back in the day. Originally, the S3 would ship with Android 4 Ice Cream Sandwich and would receive updates through to Android 4.4.2 KitKat, assuming you had one of the models with 2 gigs of RAM, which is a little confusing, but regardless, whatever it was you owned, you would always get Samsung's incredibly mediocre TouchWiz interface as the cherry on top of it all. Yeah, look, I've got a lot of praise for this phone, and a lot of the early Galaxies really, but definitely not so much when it comes to Samsung's Android skins. These always felt bloated, slow, and a pain to use. My model here thankfully doesn't have too many pre-installed apps that don't need to be here, so that's nice, but I can't help but feel this software is sort of just ugly to me, typical of early Android. There was always this odd balance between a flatter look, but also this almost pseudo skeuomorphism in how the app icons were designed. Don't forget, iPhones looked like this at this point. Very different from how things would look a couple short years later, when basically everyone would embrace the more simplistic, flatter, and modern approach. Ugly might be a strong word to describe this skin, honestly. I think it's just very dated. It absolutely screams of early Android design, while still clinging to a distinctly Samsung-esque feel. Even as someone who never owned a Samsung back in the day, I must admit, it does somehow feel very nostalgic to just even swipe around. And there's a lot of charm here as well, at times. Man, the sounds this phone makes, it's absolutely ridiculous. Like, everything you do has this water drop sound that was driving me only slightly insane while using it. Plus, we all remember the stupid whistle text tone. I feel like I can hear this in my nightmares even to this day. The lock screen with these water ripples was super appealing and looks so amazing on this AMOLED screen. The S3 really was the ultimate Samsung device. They just threw everything they had at you, and while the experience wasn't always the most consistent, it was definitely jam-packed. Feature creep is something that wasn't as much of an issue with this phone as it would quickly become with the S4 and S5, and some of what we do have here, like NFC, was really quite innovative, but you do also have some weirdness as well with things like eye tracking for Smart Stay, which is supposed to keep the screen on so long as you're looking at it. Performance today is obviously not very good, as you would expect, but just basic tasks and swiping around the user interface isn't too painful overall, so that's good. It's more when we try to do anything that actually requires processing power, like web browsing or even opening the Play Store, that things tend to slow down quick and we can lay plague this device. This is the part where I would normally list out the basic specs, but the S3 is a bit annoyingly complicated in this department, and that's underselling it for sure. Generally, you had the North American version that had the Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 chipset, and then the international version with the Samsung Exynos 4 quad chip. It doesn't really matter anymore, to be honest, but mine here is in fact the Snapdragon version with 2 GB of RAM, which made it quite powerful for 2012. Heck, when this was released, the iPhone 4S was the newest iPhone on the market still, and had only a half gigabyte of RAM, which would absolutely kill it in performance later on as Apple gave it way too many updates. And naturally, there's a bunch of different variations of the S3, since there's nothing more that Samsung loved than making this incredibly confusing for any reviewer like myself dumb enough to look back and try to sort through all these individual models. Wikipedia has this chart with 16 different models dependent on carrier and region. This is all the S3. It's just absurd to look at. Like, some of these phones didn't have 4G LTE, but most did, but then some had 1 GB of RAM, whereas most had 2. But then there was also the S3 Neo from 2014 with 1.5 gigs of RAM, and just why? Samsung, why? They're certainly not the only manufacturers guilty of overcomplicating how many versions of phones were made back in the day, but this is a pretty good example of how absurd it could get. You also had the S3 Mini come out later in 2012, which I think is at least a bit more straightforward and a nice addition to the lineup. I've been heaping plenty of praise onto Samsung for pushing the phablet market forward, but this was still a time where a lot of people preferred the smaller form factor, and having more options available is always a good thing in my eyes. Whatever you do have, you can always look at installing a custom ROM if you feel like pushing some more functionality out of your device for some reason. I mean, ultimately this phone just doesn't have that much power, so I wouldn't bother doing this anymore, but there have been plenty of projects over the years if it's something you want to mess with. The community behind the S3 is actually very impressive in what they've managed to accomplish. Kudos to them. Let's take a look at the cameras. On the front, we have a simple and terribly mediocre 1.9 megapixel selfie camera. Yeah, I mean, it's from 2012. What else would you expect from this? It was fine for the time. On the back, we have this little 8 megapixel rear-facing camera, capable of recording 1080p video at up to 30 frames per second. It's sometimes too easy to take for granted just how good smartphone cameras have gotten in the past decade, and how even a phone from only 4 or 5 years after the S3 is still pretty decent today, whereas this phone, I mean, well, it's not so decent. It's just old, and while you can potentially get some acceptable photos in the right situation, maybe, ideally outdoors and good lighting conditions, you'll probably want to snap multiple photos at a time to ensure hopefully at least one kind of turns out. And without holding pretty still, you will end up with blurry results, and the autofocus I found could really struggle to properly grab onto the subject. With some care, I got some photos that I thought were okay, or at least pretty decent, but I would definitely keep my expectations to a minimum, as with any smartphone camera from 13 years ago, what do you expect? Low light in particular is going to be very rough, but overall, hard to complain too much considering the age of this phone. For 2012, it was definitely one of the better options on the market, and it's kind of funny. There is this slight camera bump here, which of course would eventually become standard across any smartphone in future years, as these sensors just kept getting bigger and bigger. That camera being centered also lended a bit of uniqueness to Samsung's design language. This was a sleek modern smartphone from 2012, and whenever I see it, I just can't help but immediately understand why it would form the foundation for the next few years of Galaxies, as the S4 and S5 really just refined this general formula. Samsung struck gold here, and again, this was just the perfect phone at the perfect time. Of course, while there is a lot to like here and this is a fun phone to play around with, it's not usable anymore in 2025 or whatever year you might be watching this in the future. It's an old, obsolete device, but one that was an absolutely integral piece of smartphone history. This right here is really one of, if not the most important Android smartphones ever made. It was proof that Apple wasn't always going to be the industry leader in this new market, that a company like Samsung could permanently alter the direction of smartphones moving forward, pushing this larger form factor and beautiful vibrant AMOLED screen that would eventually become the norm across all flagship smartphones as we see today. This phone produced hype like no other Android ever had, with a wild 9 million pre-orders and at least 70 million units sold throughout its lifespan. This phone was often called the iPhone killer back in the day, and it's really not hard to see why. While iOS and iPhones still maintained an air of luxury and a premium build that couldn't be matched, you're always going to have far more freedom and choice going with the bigger and bolder Galaxy S3. This phone is truly something special, and one that doesn't feel anywhere near its age 13 years later in my opinion, at least until you actually try to do literally anything useful with it. Obviously the S3 doesn't hold up that great anymore, but the display and form factor factor still shine, and you can't help but respect it. This is one of the best smartphones ever made, and it deserves to be remembered as such. So I'm glad we got to take at least a brief look at it today. And with that, I think we're right about done here. Did any of you have the S3 back in the day? What do you think of it so many years later? Make sure you leave a comment down below with your thoughts. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content just like this. We do have a Discord server if you want to come by, say hi, chat with some like-minded techies. Huge shout out to the channel members for being absolutely amazing people. Thank you guys so much, and thank you all for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.